Well, welcome everyone to this session of Learn at Lunch in our ongoing education series. And before we get started, just a few reminders. Make sure you mute yourself until you have any questions or comments for James, and I'm sure he would appreciate any questions or comments both during the presentation, and he'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. We are recording this session as always, so it will be available later. I will be sending you the 6-question test that you are required to take to get the CEU credit, so you'll get that probably later this afternoon. And then again, if you have any questions, you can just speak up during the presentation, or you can ask them at the end of James's presentation. So today our presenter is Mr. James Marsh. We've known James for quite a while, so it's good to have him join us this month. And his topic is sexual boundaries. And, James, knowing that this has been one of those topics that in the past doctors, have obviously had to take the class for, for continuing ed reasons, and the Board of Examiners requires it. And I think it's just been one of those topics where doctors are kind of like, yeah, I know that. I'm not going to mess around. So I'm just going to, we'll just kind of breeze through this class. But it seems like now, the things that have happened, recently in our society, especially the Me Too movement, I think it probably tells us that we do really need to pay more attention to this, just to make sure that we don't make any mistakes or do anything wrong in our practices. Would you agree with that?
Completely. Yep. The world really has changed in the last 7-8 months, and we'll go into that in some detail today.
All right. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. James Marsh. So take it away, James.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, and thank everyone for participating in the session today, and for Jeff for putting this together. I appreciate their willingness to get this done. We'd spoken with the chiropractors here in South Dakota earlier this year. Apparently found my presentation was useful, and I hope you find it useful too. Just very briefly about myself, I worked with the Department of Labor and Regulation for 30 years, about 15 of those doing the Director of the Human Rights Office, which regulates sexual harassment and similar claims in the state. I've since retired, but gone into private consulting. And if you have information that you want to ask me about after this session is done, by all means, you can use that contact information on the screen, get a hold of me, or get a hold of Jeff. Thanks. So what are we covering? First of all, just how much has changed really in the last 8-9 months. What are the rules again? And can we come away with some takeaways that all of you can use that take some of the scariness out of this, but still give you a real reasonable sense of what the rules are and what cautions are? Well, I hope to do all those things for you today. First, to get hands around the problem, some simple statistics that have come up in the news lately from the Society of Human Resource Management. 11% of women that were surveyed with some of our larger employers said they'd been harassed at work. And by harassed, as you'll come to understand later on, it's pretty serious stuff. 76% of them said they didn't report it out of fear of retaliation or belief that nothing would be done. In a similar survey done by an outfit called Stop Street Harassment, where they identify various kinds of harassment, 38% of the women said they'd been harassed at work. And the most dramatic survey I've seen comes from the U.S. Merit System Protection Board, which makes that more like 40 to 70% of women believe they've been harassed at some point in their working careers. Harassment flourishes, in my view, in a climate of tolerance and a culture of silence. Those phrases were coined by an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Rob Bogosian. By climate of tolerance, we mean employees who see no consequences when folks are being harassed, either themselves or somebody else, and nothing gets done. Also, a culture of silence. Employees willfully fail to report what they know to be harassment, according to themselves or somebody else, because nothing's done with it. And that kind of environment is just basically a time bomb waiting to happen. And you don't want to be encouraging an environment in which those things are not dealt with. As a typical example, just to get past some of the stereotypes or suppositions about it, 25% of harassed university employees, whether male or female, report it. You'd expect in that kind of environment, that there would be a much more open feeling about when to raise issues like these. But the truth has been just the opposite. An NIH study, 64% of females reporting harassment said harassment lasted up to 6 months. It was severe and pervasive. More than half found the harassment extremely offensive and extremely upsetting. But more than 80% had to continue working with who they felt was perpetrating the harassment. So people aren't making this up or being more easily offended. We get this idea, I think, because of what's been going on in the news lately, that somehow this all just kind of rising up like a cultural wave. But the truth is, I think it's been going on all along, and it took that movement to try to bring it out to the open. And did the laws change while I wasn't looking? I mean, is anything different now over what it was for the last 50 years? Not really. State statutes haven't changed since harassment laws were written in 1969. The big difference is in the interpretation of those laws. The United States Supreme Court did not officially recognize a true sexual harassment claim until 1986. So the laws have been on the books over 20 years by then. Same-sex discrimination was not declared illegal until 1998 in the Onkal case. And the EEOC added LGBT and eventually Q, for those interested. The acronym is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning, by decision in 2012. And as culture changes, as we'll discuss more very shortly, those standards do change. They become more flexible and not nearly as forgiving, honestly. In order to be able to prove harassment, you still have to prove the same things you have since the laws were written 50 years ago. You have to prove you're a member of a protected class. You have to prove that you were qualified to do what you did. So if you are working in a job and you claim harassment, you have to be able to prove you're actually performing the job at a minimum level of competence. There has to be some type of adverse action or conduct amounting to a constructive discharge. So on one side, the person has to prove if they were fired, for example, that they were fired, that they were denied a promotion, that they didn't get some kind of advancement, something involving money. Or conduct amounting to a constructive discharge is they eventually were compelled to quit because the environment was so hostile. There has to be direct evidence of discrimination or evidence from which discrimination can be inferred. After all, it's not as if people are going to walk up and say, yeah, I'm discriminating against you today because you're a member of a class. It's going to more likely be a picture that gets painted by your behavior. And the proof is enough to make the case go forward, in Latin, the prima facie case. And we'll discuss more of the significance of that shortly. If the charging party made this basic case of enough to go forward and say, yeah, we got something here, the employer has to prove it had a legitimate non-discriminatory reason for whatever it did. If they let somebody go, they have to prove, hey, this person was a schmuck, okay? They have to be able to demonstrate that there were concrete, legitimate reasons for their actions. The employee can still prove the employer was lying about those reasons for its actions, what we describe legally as pretext. Let's say, for example, you say, well, we eliminated this person because they were a poor performer, something like that. We come in and we find out that every other person in the place performs just like this person does. And so it starts to smell a little bit like this person is being singled out for some other reason. And if that's the case, we can believe that you had reason to lie, that you're concealing something from us because you gave us one explanation and it ended up being something else. All right. The employer's defense has to be based on the employee being qualified for the job. Now, that's changed in the last couple of years. The Supreme Court in our state came out with a ruling that said an employee is qualified when they, quote unquote, objectively meet the minimum qualifications of the job versus satisfactorily performing the job. Difference is satisfactory performance is something decided by the employer, pretty subjective. They come in and they say, well, we had this set of rules that we wanted this person to follow, they didn't do them. We had this performance standard we want them to meet, they didn't meet them. Versus an outsider looking at it and saying, okay, what are 5 things you need this person to do? Are they doing those things? And we think they are. So in a way, it's the qualification standard has changed from a very personal, individual one to one that's almost like a community standard or state standard. A person is not qualified if they're disruptive, insubordinate, making mistakes that any reasonable employee could have stopped after they were told about them, those kinds of things. So To some degree, the standard is still common sense, but it still is more objective, more distanced from you than it used to be. And if you have a series of reasons for somebody that are perfectly legitimate for letting them go, and somewhere in there, there is a bad one, or if you're engaging in certain behavior towards this person that would be perfectly legitimate in 10 ways and not legitimate in the 11th, I'll leave you with the example of the Michigan 4-H program as to how to look at that. Okay, Michigan 4-H, the rule is for the large animal contests that they have to be dressed in white, including the shoes, head to toe. Okay, and if there's any amount of not white at the end of the day, that person is marked down for it. Okay? It doesn't matter how little or how much. Now you would think, wow, I'm cleaning a cow and I'm supposed to keep my shoes white. How does that work? But that's how the program works. And we look at these types of claims as an agency the same way. We look at them and say, well, you had 9 of the things that were great, but guess what? This one thing where you engaged in this illegal behavior, that was bad. So it doesn't matter how much poop is on your shoes, it still stinks. All right, so what could be considered harassment? Thought you'd love this little masher montage I came up with here for people who are potentially being accused of that. What you need to know about what you've seen in the news lately is that these folks are only one type of harassment and really not the most common one. Okay, what we're seeing in terms of these behaviors is what we'd call quid pro quo. Pick a big shot for any of these examples. There is a tangible action taken in exchange for sex. So a person says, I'll give you the job as an actress if you sleep with me, that kind of thing. Quid pro quo. That actually is pretty unusual in terms of the overall scheme of claims made for sexual discrimination or harassment in our state. Instead, the focus more generally is on creating a hostile work environment where there isn't any sexual behavior at all. Okay. What we found is in almost our state's cases or Supreme Court cases that talk about harassment, not a single one involved actual sexual behavior. That was not the ground for what they did. Instead, it was behavior that was directed towards someone based on sex, but was premised on an abuse of power. Think these claims as more as bullying claims instead of sexual behavior claims. Okay. For examples, and I'll have you add non-consensual to each one of these because that puts it in perspective. Consensual behavior is protected. Non-consensual is not. Non-consensual behavior includes just hanging around, following people, stalking them excessively, touching them. Okay, I mean, we're accustomed, many of us, particularly in this state, to just putting a hand on a shoulder or giving a hug once in a while. Those kinds of things are fine as long as the behavior is accepted and consensual. But it leads to problems when the person basically says, well, if I say anything about this, they're not going to like it, so I'm just not going to say anything. And eventually it builds up and blows up. So hugs, massages, neck rubs, the old arm around the shoulder, that is a classic illustration in most videos for what constitutes potentially harassing behavior. Brushing up against someone inadvertently, but turns out to be not so inadvertent. Lewd conduct, you see that a lot with the national news stuff, people just simply exposing themselves at a motel room or in the back room of an office, things like that. Sexual comments being made. And that leads to actually the most common type of basis for a harassment claim, verbal conduct. Things like asking about a person's sex life, asking about their fantasies or preferences, comments about their body. Boy, you look really nice today. I mean, it's one thing to say, boy, you really look nice today. And boy, you really look nice today. Making noises towards them, kissing sounds, howling and whistling. These kinds of things happen in actual cases. Asking for a date repeatedly. Okay. One up, one down. Yes, no, maybe so. They're not going to be concerned about that. But where we come back to it over and over and over again, that probably fits in the category of what we would call the water torture test for harassment. Okay. Somebody comes to you as an employee, you're sitting there minding your own business, just say you're female, and somebody, an outside customer, a patient, it might be for you as chiropractors, might be someone who works on the staff, and they walk up and they ask for a date. And the employee says, no, not interested. Okay, well, that's one drop on the head. Okay, one time in which this person's a little annoyed, but hey, life goes on, this stuff happens. I mean, people ask each other for dates at work all the time. But then the next day it happens again after you've told them no. And then the third day it happens again. And after another week, it's happened 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times. Well, finally, enough drops on the water come up that it starts to get to the point where a person cannot perform their job effectively. They start to get really concerned. They say, well, I think there's supposed to be rules against persistently doing this in my workplace, but I don't know that there are. And I don't know if I could tell anyone if there were. And suddenly this thing is turning into a problem. And in those cases, finally, it's like one last drop of water on the head, and the person is simply driven out of their job. They can't, whatever it is they're being called upon to do at that desk that day, they can't do it anymore, and they leave. All the hostile work environment constructive discharge cases assume that the person quit. Those are all quit cases, as opposed to adverse action cases where someone is fired or has had something done to them. In a constructive discharge case, they leave. So they are, in essence, it's like they were fired because they were driven out, hence the phrase constructive discharge. Okay? Sex jokes. Let me just simply say, particularly in light of what has happened since, say, last fall, you can take it as, if there is such a thing as an absolute rule in this field, and I think pretty soon there's going to be, this is a grade A no-no. If you want to try to pursue a harassment claim and you can prove that there were sex jokes told in the office more than once, and you showed that you didn't approve of them or didn't want them brought up, that's like a time bomb. I mean, there's just, I mean, that's the closest to a smoking gun that we've got. If you have a choice, if there are others saying things in the room like that, if there are customers coming in, if there are people you contract with saying things like that, you have to step up and you have to say, no, this, you take it outside. I mean, it's just the time for that has come and gone. All right. Nonverbal behavior, things like staring at people all day long. It happens. Blocking a path. Somebody gets through, you stand in their way deliberately. Messages on hats or mugs or clothing, calendars, computer screens, cell phones. I got to tell you, in terms of risk management, I'm sure those people who have to deal with that say the cell phone is the worst invention in the history of mankind, because there's things that goes on cell phones that it's kind of difficult to believe. Between that and social media, it's hard to believe what people will say or bring up in social media platforms as if they honestly believe that no one is ever going to follow up on it, or that it's not as public as they think it is. Gestures, things with your hands, your face, your body, things that you're doing, those can lead to harassing behavior. Letters or gifts with crudities on them or suggestions on them. Pranks or horseplay. I mean, a workplace can be some place where you can have some fun, don't get me wrong, but I think we all recognize that there are times when that level of horseplay can step over a line, and you don't want to go there. A topic I'll dwell on a little bit here is on the question of body space. Studies and science have been going on involving this area in some detail for about 50 years now, starting with a guy named Dr. Hall, who invented the concept of distance bubbles. He was an anthropologist from the University of California, and discovered more by accident than design that people have what he would call distance bubbles: public bubbles, social bubbles, personal bubbles, and intimate bubbles, depending on how close they are and the environment in which you're doing it. It varies by culture a little bit. If you are a Latino, for example, I mean, we don't want to too much overgeneralize, but it is true that if you're Latino or you're from Southern Europe or from Asia, that these distances can vary. They tend to get closer, okay? Whereas in North America or from Northern Europe, those folks want a greater distance between them. But I am reminded of the bit from Seinfeld when we had the close talker. Judge Reinhold played the part of a person who, it seemed like every time Jerry Seinfeld or somebody or his family would turn around, this guy is like right there, right in their faces. And that's an example of how that public bubble or that private bubble gets invaded. And of course, we've all are familiar with scenes from the military when somebody comes up as a drill sergeant and they're like 3 inches from your face. They're coming in there deliberately, because they know when they've invaded your space, so to speak, that little bubble you've got, that they are exerting power over you. It's just reality. It is also true that face-to-face distances tend to be farther away, or need to be farther away, than if you're near someone. Take, for example, what inspired Dr. Hall to start this study in the first place. He was in an elevator, in a crowded one, and decided to turn around just to see what people would do. And he was actually shocked by the reactions he got. I mean, he wasn't any closer to them face to face than he had been before. But as soon as people notice they're looking at you, eyes would avert, hands would cross, arms would cross at the shoulders, people would look away. I mean, it was as if somebody done something awful all of a sudden, or they were being attacked. And so he decided, is this a systemic thing? Is it something just this elevator, or is it something all over the place? But anyway, he did decide to break up this bubble concept into these 4 categories. The public category is where you might see a public speech or a teacher teaching in class. If they're more than 4 feet away, that's what you expect. If you had to, what's the worst thing in school when you have to move your desk right up to the teacher? You're moving into that 4-foot zone. So it would be expected that that distance is maintained. A social distance, which is more common, and actually they found repeatedly in work studies is conducive to productivity in work. The distance between 18 inches, about 4 feet. So you can about imagine, if you're having a discussion with someone across a desk, for example, that if you get much farther than 4 feet away, it's like they're not paying attention, or you're really not getting through, okay? Or if you're sitting side by side at desks and they're in that 4 foot to 18-inch zone, that you expect to be able to communicate with them. But you get 18 inches or closer, which you might, as a rule of thumb, which you could guess from the end of your elbow to maybe the end of your thumb extended, okay, about 18 inches. You get any closer than that, then you start to enter into what Dr. Hall described as an intimate zone, okay? Now, one study that intrigued me in particular, following up on his findings, was they put people in an MRI and they registered their brainwave activity. And they had people that they knew or people that they didn't know walk close to them. And eventually, when they got in that 18-inch zone, the gland called the amygdala, kind of at the base of your cerebellum, just went berserk. Every time they would get in that 18-inch zone, it was just like went crazy, particularly among females. And the conclusion that they reached eventually is that involuntarily, people react by getting that close to you in significantly sexual terms. They see it being physically threatened and possibly being sexually attacked, even if they don't really think that consciously. So I guess something to keep in mind. Once you get within that thumb to elbow zone, you have to think carefully about the effect you're having on people, whether it's patients or you are. And I know you have. This is chiropractic, for goodness sakes. You are physically touching people, but that closeness can present results that you didn't expect. All right. Constructive discharge. We've talked about that off and on. Let's get into the details of what that means. First, it has to affect an employment term, condition, or privilege. Okay? A person has to be affected in their ability to do their work. The attitude they have about it, how comfortable they are doing it. There is no need for any kind of adverse action. You don't have to have done anything in order for it to be a constructive discharge that affects their ability to earn a living. In fact, that was one of the reasons why the Supreme Court struggled with it a bit up until 1986. In the case that was the seminal one in that area, they said, well, was the woman fired? No. Was she denied a promotion? No. Did anything actually happen to her that affected her job? No. But the level of behavior that was engaged in was incredible. The pressure that she was receiving to go out on dates, to do this and do that. And she just didn't want any of it. And she told them so. And eventually they said, no, this got to the point where she was mentally disturbed as a result of how much this went on. The behavior has to be subjectively and objectively severe and or pervasive, okay? So it is not enough that the person thinks that they're being harassed. An outside person like you or me investigating the matter has to look at it and say, yep, it is. This is bad. It can be a one-time instance, that's rare. It generally tends to be a pervasive line of conduct where it's all around you. It's happening all the time. What you need to understand is that in the light of what's happened with sexual harassment awareness, groups like Me Too, Time's Up, the Weinstein bit, that the threshold, both subjectively and objectively, for what's going to be considered inappropriate behavior has changed. Okay? I mean, I almost think of myself a conversation going on. I don't have to put up with this anymore. Well, how about that? A woman saying, well, I used to have to tolerate this, but the world has said that it's no longer acceptable behavior, so I'm not going to accept it. And the investigator that looks at it, their glasses are going to change too, because it used to be that a lot of what simply people put up with as a part of our culture, they're not going to put up with it anymore. And it's now going to be considered harassing, whereas it was not previously. Now, write the check. When do you have to do that? In other words, when is it so bad that you might as well figure, it's time to talk to somebody about settling this thing? Well, it depends on who's doing it and what did you do about it. If the supervisor is the harasser, then there's tangible action. This person was fired, and it's a result of, say, quid pro quo. I wanted to have sex with this person as a supervisor. They refused, and I fired them. Okay, you lose. I mean, that's write the check. 100% case where there's just no negotiating that stuff with us. A non-tangible action, okay, by a supervisor. We didn't fire you, but we were engaged in harassing behavior. You're probably going to lose unless you, as an employer, took reasonable care to prevent it. And when it happened, you promptly, decisively, and thoroughly investigated it. Let's say you have an office manager in charge of who's a male, in charge of your secretaries, and your secretaries are female. And this male has been engaging in harassing behavior. They're going to stand in your shoes as a supervisor. But if you didn't know anything about what was going on, and once you learned it, you took the steps to address it, that's going to score points with us as a department. Okay. The opposite example would be where we had a fast food place up by in the northern part of the state. We had a manager and assistant manager who were buddy-buddy, had known each other since high school. The assistant manager was accused by teenage workers in the front desk of coming on to them. Again, there was no, they weren't denied jobs, they weren't denied promotions or had wage cuts, anything like that. He was just putting the moves on them all. And they would come to the manager and say, nobody said anything at first, but finally one girl spoke up and said, this has been going on. I wish you'd investigate it. The manager's investigation consisted of going back to the assistant manager, which, for the record, first of all, is your first mistake. If you've got that kind of behavior going on, go to the victim, not the perpetrator first, or the accused perpetrator first. Go to the victim first and ask questions. But if that came up, went back to the assistant manager and said, wow, has this been going on? And the assistant manager shrugged his shoulders, almost literally, and said, no, they're just making it up. Well, and that was the end of the investigation. That's as much as he did. He didn't go back and try to, bounce that off any of the workers, or he never asked them any questions. Instead, it was just his buddy had said it, so I guess that's how it was. Well, about 2 weeks after that, his buddy had cornered one of the workers in a closet enough and was engaging in enough open behavior that he was busted for attempted rape. And then the whole thing fell like a house of cards. Every employee that was on the edge of this came in and filed human rights complaints with us, and the employer lost on several occasions, and it cost them quite a bit of money. So bottom line is, what you need to do is when you see this stuff going on or have it brought to your attention, you've got to step up and address it. Do you need a policy in that regard? Do you need a statement that says we do not agree, we do not believe in harassment? I think that's a good idea, and you have to give people specific ideas about what to do if it comes up. All right. But by the way, if you do that, you need to follow up on it. If the non-supervisor is a harasser, it's just a coworker, that can happen just as frequently. Did you know about it? Were specific complaints raised? Was the employee directly or indirectly treated badly? And have there been third-party complaints about the same person? Okay. And once you knew about that kind of thing, did you investigate it and fix it? Did you act quickly? I've spoken with many attorneys who specialize in this area, and they work both in our state and in federal agencies in the area. And they say 1 to 2 weeks. If you don't get it done in 1 to 2 weeks, a court or a part of an agency is not going to see that you did enough concretely to try to fix the problem. Okay. Policies and training. Have a complaint process, follow, tell your employees, and repeat it. Okay. What's a good plan? 94% of human rights of human resource professionals have policies. They acknowledge that they did. When their employees were asked about those policies, only 22% of them knew about them. Experts agree that when you're doing training, to simply don't do it training doesn't work. Okay, if you go to them and say, bad boy, this is good, this is bad, blah, 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 that is never going to work effectively. Instead, on a long-term basis, you have to encourage positive interactions where you're telling people, look, this stuff is going to go on from time to time. And if it comes up, we want you to know that you can come to us, tell us whatever is going on, and we're going to deal with it. Reaffirm the policy to the victim when they complain. And for your own protection, nail down whether they knew about it and used it. Because it is a defense. If you have the policy, you are, as the owner or supervisor of the business, not the one doing it, and they don't take those steps that your policy lays out for their protection. They lose. Good plan part 2, monitor your workplace, keep your eyes open. Maintain a reporting process, confidentiality. Okay? Intermediate supervisors are lousy gatekeepers. If you've got an office manager in charge of your secretaries, your secretary comes in and says, I had this problem, don't count on that supervisor to be the one to try to deal with all the stuff. That's your gig or somebody that you directly contract to do that. Interview victims first, not harassers. Just so you know, one of the developments that's come up in the field in the last few months is don't plan on non-disclosure settlements. If they come up and they accuse you or your company of having harassed people, and then you end up settling with them, which is what happens to 80 to 90% of these sorts of claims, don't plan on it not being made public at some point, because both state and federal agencies are looking at those non-disclosure settlements much more suspiciously. Okay, the punishment should fit the crime. If you do have a harasser out there in your shop and you need to deal with it, it should depend on the severity of the behavior. If it's a one-time incident, treat it like that. If it's an ongoing thing that's been going on for months, that's different. Use counseling or training. There's lots of training available. You may have to suspend them or discharge them. You might have to demote them or do something by way of a pay reduction. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but sometimes an apology works, especially in an isolated incident. Especially these days, though, an apology seems to prompt a meh. We've got plenty of these people, the Weinsteins of the world, who say, well, I'm sorry if people thought that my behavior was bad, but gosh, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. That kind of lame-o thing is really not going to be accepted very warmly. No contact with a victim. And if the harasser violates that rule, can them. Okay. We need to keep a physical distance between people if there's that kind of problem. But we don't want to have a situation where 80% of the perpetrators were still in there in the same environment with the worker. Keep an eye out for retaliation by the staff. Believe it or not, that sort of thing does happen where co-workers are. In fact, one of the Supreme Court cases that came up, the co-workers came in and once they found out that the foreman was the one who was the subject of the complaint and were filling the girl's shoes with sand and trashing her tools and putting holes in her tires. I mean, all kinds of nasty stuff. And that does not create the environment that you want to create. 10-second takeaways. What do we got? I want to leave time for questions. First of all, the world changed overnight with the Me Too and other types of movements. Don't assume that whatever worked for you for the last year or 10 years or 20 years is going to work anymore, because it's not. Your people have changed, whether consciously or unconsciously, and you need to adjust your behavior to it. It is intolerable, not because it's based on sex per se. It's not like people that are accused of these things are having sex with their coworkers or with their subordinates, but because they're engaging in bullying, abuse of power that denies opportunity. That is at the core of all our discrimination laws. Have harassment policies and procedures. Have an expert review them and follow them. Show some leadership. You come into your group right away after a meeting like this and you say, wow, I listened to this Marsh guy talking about harassment all day long. I just want you to know that it's not tolerable in my shop, and not now, not ever. And if you have problems, you come to me. Sincere commitment at the top protects your bottom. Okay, address complaints quickly, firmly, and completely. Leave no room for doubt about where you are. And don't be too proud or oblivious to ask for help if things come up. All right, I want to leave questions. Time for questions for folks. Anything that comes to mind? Whoa, yeah, that went away.
All right, if you do have any questions for James, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Wow. Okay, I must have done a bang-up job, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe while they're thinking, James, what was some of the feedback you got when you gave the presentation in Sioux Falls? Mm-hmm. Were there some questions and comments from some of the doctors there?
Yeah, they were a little surprised at some of the aspects of it. In particular, that I mean, you think of sexual harassment being the classic quid pro quo thing, but that really isn't where most of it is at all. And I think they were genuinely shocked at that. And I think sometimes the reaction is also a little bit too much. It's like, well, can I say something that's a little bit funny and suddenly I get to get called on the carpet for it? Well, you do have to know your people. You have to know your limits, but you should avoid those things to a degree that you did not have to in the past. So I think mostly it was well received. I do have to say that sometimes you can't live in a vacuum. Like say our office investigated these claims when I was there for 14 years. And the classic example to me of how the thing went off the rails was when we had a chiropractor who had said, this was consensual behavior. There was never anything that went on between me and my staff that was a problem. And the staff member, when provided with this information, because that's part of our investigative process, we tell them what they're being told, what we're being told, is they sent pictures from a convention that they'd been to. And the chiropractor's hand is shown in a group shot on the woman's breast while they're taking taking a group photo. And she says, I'm not sure what you think, but I didn't ask for this person's hand to be there. And, we really, I don't see how that could be viewed as consensual. So, I mean, the fact that, we denied any behavior at all was really, so, like I say, the whole pretextual thing and the confusing thing, don't expect to lie to us and not people that are claiming being subjected to it and to be able to be free of it. Other questions?
All right. Anybody have any questions for James while we have him online with us?
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody again for joining in on the call. Again, if you have questions afterwards, if you just feel like you need to talk to me one-on-one, I take them for free, so that's always a good thing. Yeah. And if nothing else, give the agency a call out in Pierre. Their number is 605-773 oh my God, 3681. I almost forgot the number. It hasn't been that long. Yeah, 605-773-3681 and ask to speak to Ray or Tom. And they should be able to address your questions. So.
All right. Well, thanks, James, and we appreciate you presenting this information for us.
Thanks for the opportunity. Take care, Jeff.
All right. Talk to you later.
You bet. Bye.